Okay, hi everybody, welcome to week 9 for motor control and learning. This week we're going to be shifting gears a little bit and exploring a theory called ecological psychology and how it can be used to help inform ways in which we control and learn to act skillfully. So I'll be looking at evidence related to this called affordance-based control, and then applications in terms of how to design learning contexts that are representative and can best facilitate the ability to learn skills that we can transfer. So these are the learning outcomes for this week. Take a moment to read through these before heading into the lecture, just so you've got a sense of the sorts of things that I want you to be able to learn. We'll revisit these at the end as questions as well. These are the 3 questions I want you to be broadly thinking about as we move through each section of the lecture. So first question is, do you need to be able to move in order to be able to perceive? Second question is it relevant to train your anticipation skill without also completing the movement associated with that anticipation? And finally, how can we maximize our ability to transfer our skills from training to competition? So we're going to learn about a theory called, broadly I've called it ecological psychology, but another term for it is called direct perception. It's a theory of direct perception. So this ecological psychology theory is a theory that's interesting because it explains how we perceive and act on information. And it helps answer these practical questions of how should we design training situations in order to facilitate the transfer of our skill, to have what we experience in training support performance in competition or some other context of interest. And it relates most closely to these findings that in tasks where the person isn't able to act, but they're making decisions, the behavior is significantly changed. So the design of your experimental situation or the skill that you're observing, the way that environment is designed has a very significant impact on the sorts of behaviors people will exhibit. And hopefully that's intuitive. And the way in which this theory looks at information and relates it to action is information is already immediately meaningful. Information in the environment has meaning, and it allows for the direct perception of that meaning. We directly perceive what information means in terms of how it can support our ability to do things, to act. So we couple our actions in order to maintain what we perceive in the environment. So there's no step here that's identified that involves disambiguating or adding or enriching the information in the environment. The only steps that are involved are the ability to pick up and detect that information and then start to use it to maintain or achieve a particular objective. So if we were to briefly summarize ecological psychology in how it characterizes learning, in this theory, information is specific to the objects, events in the environment, and this can directly guide our movement. So perception and action are direct. There's no need for any intermediate processing stages to enrich or disambiguate that information in order to achieve a perception. For successful performance, the individual actively seeks out information in order to perceive opportunities for action, and these are called affordances. An opportunity for action referred to as an affordance. And these affordances So affordances refer to opportunities for action that the environment offers the observer. And the movements that we generate serve to maintain our perception of affordances or a particular individual environment relationship. So ecological psychology characterizes perception and action as interdependent. And the learning process involves discovering opportunities for action, learning to attend to relevant sources of information to control affordances, and then being able to calibrate our movements to be increasingly accurate. So these are the four key concepts in this lecture. We're going to briefly juxtapose this theory with, we'll talk about anti-representational theory in general. We'll talk about direct perception, the nature of information, and these concepts called the law of control. So we're now going to push into a series of lectures that relate to what can be described as anti-representational theories or non-representational theory. And so previously, the past theories that we've dealt with have looked at the information in the environment as meaningless. It gets detected, and we use these internal representations to add meaning, to make sense of this information. From there, we go through these stages of making the decision with respect to what we've perceived, and then programming and executing the movement that we've decided to do. Okay, so our relationship with the environment is mediated by representations. And so the alternative approach that we're going to work with are called anti-representational theories. And they provide an alternative way of explaining perception action that doesn't rely on or require calling on representations in order to mediate our relationship with that information that we pick up in the environment. And these concepts, they come from a range of different, philosophers or viewpoints of philosophy. And Hubert Dreyfus is a really good example of people advocating for these non-representational approaches. There's a great movie called Being in the World, which you can watch on Netflix or on YouTube. Highly recommend that you give it a watch. And you can see that sort of, philosophical debate played out as a movie. And this movie in particular talks about a lot of the contributions of Hubert Dreyfus. So he argued that learning is not about the internalization of rules, but reflects a change in how we perceive the world. So, and his argument sort of goes as follows. He argues that, look, if expert rules could be extracted and programmed, we could design programs that exhibit expertise. And yet systems that try to use these sorts of approaches typically fail to fulfill the promise of having an expert system. And his argument is that one of the reasons for this is that experts can't tell you what the rules are because they don't use rules in order to achieve or exhibit expertise. That's also not at the unconscious level. And that's because learning doesn't result in automatization, right? Rather than automating what we do and that reflecting expertise, what experts do is they perceive the world in a different way. So they use different information to guide their action. And of course, being experts, what this implies is they're using more appropriate information compared to a beginner. So anti-representational theories, they see the environment as directly meaningful. that doesn't require some sort of a computational step or set of steps in order to understand. So it aims to understand perception and action by focusing on the interaction between the individual and their environment without giving some sort of a priority to representations that occur internally in the organism. So they eliminate the notion of mental representation, and they think that behavior can be understood without a whole lot of mental gymnastics going on. And an example we can give here would be, okay, so if a person's flying, right, and they want to make sure that they're flying forward and they're not going to crash into the ground, one thing that they can do is they can orientate their plane so that the focus of expansion, right, so these patterns of movement from the sky and from the ground, right, the focus of expansion, the center point that doesn't change in this image is at the center. If they wanted to land the plane or orientate down here, all the pilot has to do is orientate the plane so that the focus of expansion comes to the runway. So the pilot isn't making any sort of computation about angle of approach and et cetera, they're not doing any, they're not using Pythagoras theorem to work out the distances between where they are in X, Y, Z. They're using some information that's available due to their movement that can directly guide their behavior. And let's say fairly complex behavior, successfully landing or maneuvering an aeroplane. So the main proposition in ecological psychology is, firstly, it's anti-representational or non-representational. It doesn't require representations to disambiguate or add meaning to the environment. So the second main proposition is that of information being meaningful. So the environment has a direct one-to-one relationship with information. And there's a direct relationship between information that the environment specifies and what we perceive. So there's direct relationships. There's no need to add value in order to achieve a perception. Another proposition of ecological psychology is the concept of affordances. So, and how it is that we establish an affordance and then maintain it. So an affordance, again, it's an opportunity for action, and affordances are what we perceive. So when we pick up information in the environment, we perceive that information as an opportunity for action. And then this allows us to establish a law of control, where a law of control is a way of moving in order to maintain the perception of that opportunity, of that affordance. Learning, then, the final proposition in this framework is that learning involves, firstly, a discovery of affordances, and education of attention, where we identify what information is best useful for maintaining that affordance, and then becoming increasingly calibrated to the use of that information to support the perception of our affordance. So calibration being moving increasingly accurately with respect to that information to maintain the affordance. Okay, so these are the main concepts of ecological psychology. Okay, so to summarize again, in ecological psychology, there are no internal processes or representations that are needed to be able to understand the usefulness of information. Information is meaningful there's a specific relationship between the environment and the information, and that information specifies the relationship between us and the environment. And so it can be directly used to support achieving a particular environment organism relationship, and we use our movements in order to maintain that relationship. And what is perceived from that information, again, are opportunities for action, are affordances. So we don't perceive distances, sizes, shapes, and so forth. We perceive opportunities for action. So it's a different set of language to what we're used to, perhaps. And this would argue, and there's a little image here of a radio, a radio. And the basic concept here is that, right, so that as a coach or a therapist or as a learner or an athlete, your task is to tune yourself, get attuned to what information is best useful to you to be able to, achieve what you need to achieve, what opportunities for action you need to use, and then what movements can maintain that affordance. So we look at, so the radio analogy is a good analogy to use for understanding what a learner does as they improve. They become more attuned to more useful information. Okay, so this next concept called the specificity of information. So information is not thought of in terms of bits or cues or uncertainty that needs to be reduced through processing, right? That's something that's a language that we've used. But ecological psychology doesn't think about information in these terms. Rather, information reflects patterns of energy that surround us. So, for example, if we're talking about light, we might describe this ambient optic array. So through our movement, there's this constant flux of light that's available to us that gives us information about how quickly we're moving and our relationship to objects and events. So this ambient array informs us about the motion of the perceiver, and our movements create information which is used to guide our action and supports the perception of opportunities for action. So there's a coupling between perception and action that's constantly ongoing. And I want to give a couple of examples here in video just to get across what this implies. So I've already talked a little bit about, the concept of, as a pilot, what you can do is if you tune your actions relative to this information, you're able to achieve relatively complex tasks in a relatively simple manner by coupling your movements to this information. So I'll show a clip of how a pilot might go about landing a plane. And I want you to try to draw your attention to, how might they be using the focus of expansion as a way of guiding the plane into a landing maneuver.
You're would be to be free, to be wild, and to be just like a child. And if I get lost, I really don't mind, 'cause I'm me, doing just fine.
So there you go. So hopefully you could see how, okay, as a pilot was, if they're moving straight, then the focus of expansion is the point that I suppose is invariant in that ambient array is right at the center of the horizon. Everything else is expanding from that point of reference. When landing the plane, the pilot, what they do is they center the focus of expansion onto the runway. So everything else is expanding from that point of invariance, and they couple the movements, their movements using, of the joystick, which corresponds to the movements of the plane, to maintaining that particular relationship. I want to give another example just now about how humans might be using this information constantly to support postural stability.
Important then is this visual information in maintaining balance. In most adults, even when doing a difficult task, the sway is small and balance is easily maintained. But if visual information is important, then it should be possible to upset a subject's balance in an experimental room by moving the room gently forwards or backwards. Infants learning to stand are less stable than the adult and far more easily put off balance. The infant in this experiment has only been walking for a month. When we move the room backwards, the child falls. And again. In 92 trials of this type with 7 infants, balance was clearly disturbed in the predicted direction in 82% of the trials. It seems then that for the infant learning to maintain balance, visual information is far more potent than mechanical information. But the adult, however, is less sensitive to conflict between visual and mechanical information, and movements of the room do not, as with the infant, knock him over. But let us give him an unfamiliar balancing task, such as standing on a narrow beam. With his eyes closed, he depends solely on mechanical stimuli, quickly becomes unstable, and falls off. Or, with his eyes open, if the room is moved, even slightly, he will lose his balance, just as the infant did.
Okay, so that last clip hopefully highlights for you the important role that vision has in supporting postural stability, and just how coupled our movements are to the information that we're picking up with our visual system. One of the, I guess, to summarize what's happened in this moving wall experiment, essentially what's going on is, okay, so as the wall moves toward the person, we have this outflow of information, right? And it leads to the person potentially falling backwards or swaying backwards. And the reason why that happens, of course, is that, if you imagine a situation where you're not in a moving room, right? You're just standing there. If a wall started to appear to come towards you, it would mean that you were falling forwards, right? And so you would create a corrective movement to bring yourself back upright, to avoid falling over. And that's why people fall over backwards when the wall comes towards them. It's because of these corrective movements from your postural system, and again, revealing just how tightly coupled these movements are to the information that you're picking up and perceiving in the environment. So the idea that information is specific is to say, as I said before, that the relationship between the environment and information is correspondent. It's one-to-one. And this is also true for the relationship between information and what we perceive. Information specifies or has a one-to-one relationship with perception. So we would say that perception is veridical. It doesn't require interpretation. And this is because of these two specificity relations, right? That the environment specifies information. Similarly, that information specifies the environment, and that information specifies perception. So the structured information, such as light or sound, determines what we perceive. Okay? Deterministic relationship between information and our perception. So the perception of our environment, therefore, is simply the pickup of information without the need of any computational process. So perception involves making contact with our environment. And we use this, once we've made contact with the environment, we use the perception that we achieve to guide our action, to maintain that perception, right? Now I'm going to give an example of a specific example that's been studied before, involved in how it is that we regulate our movements relative to a specific type of information in order to catch an object that's approaching us. So just pay attention. I'm about to move to the next slide, and it'll be a slide involving a looming example. So pay attention. You should put your eyes at the center of the slide. All right, 3, 2, 1. So just then, I presented an object, a ball in this example, that approached the screen at a constant velocity, actually, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger at a constant rate until it took up the whole screen. And if you wanted to regulate, your movements in order to dodge that object or to catch that ball, you would be, according to this theory, you would be coupling your movements to a information source that specifies when that object is going to arrive. And this example it's widely used in ecological psychology, and it's called tau. So an information source that specifies the time to contact is called tau. And it's believed that in animals, humans, once we can pick up and tune to this information variable, we can use this to better and more successfully achieve tasks like catching objects or avoiding collisions. So, and one of the interesting things about tau is that if we couple our movements with respect to tau, it means that we can achieve some future state, like successfully catch the ball, without making any predictions. From one moment to the next, as long as we regulate our actions with respect to tau, we're going to achieve a particular state in the future. There's no predictive judgment required. From moment to moment, we just have to lock into that information and guide our actions with respect to it, and we will achieve a future task such as dodge or catch. Okay? And this example, for that reason, it's used to show that our relationship with the environment isn't on the basis of prediction. It's what they call prospection. It's on the basis of prospective control. We regulate our movements with respect to information currently available that will allow us, if we use it, to achieve a future state. So let's look at how tau works. And we can look at it mathematically in order to look at it from a different point of view. I don't expect you to memorize these equations, okay? But these equations are based on the equations of velocity, so you're going to be using them a lot in your courses. And hopefully, if we look at it from this point of view, it might be a little bit more intuitive for some people who like the mathematics. So the way tau works is, if you imagine the time to contact, as an object approaches you, the time that it will hit you is based on the velocity of the object, z dot, represented here, as well as the distance between you and the object, okay, represented with the z here at the top. So if we divide the distance divided by the velocity, that gives us how much time it's going to take to hit us, right? And we did a version of this formula last week when we calculated the reaction time, visual motor reaction time, from our ruler drop experiment. So how do we get access to this information variable, time to contact? Well, there's a relationship between there's a direct relationship or a corresponding relationship between the angle between the top and the bottom of this object, right? So the size of that angle divided by the rate at which that angle changes or expands specifies when that object is going to hit us, right? So if we attune our movements to, on the one hand, the object size and its rate of expansion, implying that we need to be in some way moving with respect to this object, we can perceive directly when it's going to hit us. And if we guide our movements with respect to tau, we're going to be able to either dodge or catch that object. There's also other examples of the specificity of information, and sometimes, so for example, another good example of this is in point light displays. So we can pick up on fairly complex movements. We can identify relatively complex things if we can, when we're just shown certain features of that behavior. So let's have a look at what I mean by that. So a point light display is simply, there are certain key points that you'll have visual access to, and I want you to identify what's going on, what behaviors occurring here. So this is of course walking. So there are certain you're being exposed to information, particularly useful information that specifies walking, right? So there are perhaps invariant features or specifying sources of information that are available in people's movements that relate to or specify a particular behavior, in this case walking. You might think about other things as well. Perhaps the if you're observing somebody running towards you and you're a football player, there is going to be specifying information in their body's movement, in the body movement, that is going to directly relate to which direction they will eventually be committed to, right? For example, their center of mass at some point is going to be committed to one direction or another, and there's particularly useful information in their movement that will allow you to know which way they're going to go. And part of becoming an expert in tackling people or dodging people is being able to guide your own movements with respect to more useful information. So working out what is the useful part of the person's body to attune to and use to guide your action. And of course, there are different ways that we can pick up that information. And I want to stress, one of the important ways in which we are able to do this, to find this specifying information, is through exploration, through moving. So it's through moving that we're able to work out, okay, what changes and what doesn't change in this optic array, and what can be useful for me for making or guiding my actions in order to be successful. And the example here from this image is, of a person who wants to work out what's the good line to putt, right? And this putter isn't just going to stay in the one spot. They're going to move around and explore that landscape, and they're going to be able to pick up certain features that are going to support a more successful action. Okay, so the final part of this first section of the lecture is about the concept of a law of control and how this relates to affordances. So affordances imply that we establish some control, law of control between what we perceive and our movements. So producing an action implies that we've established some relationship with the environment. We've set up an affordance or law of control. So we've started to couple movements with information in order to achieve that opportunity for action or perception. So a law of control expresses how information and movement get coupled, where information controls movement and movement generates information. So this equation here represents, on the one side of the equation, movements that generate information, and on the other side of the equation, our perception. Okay, the information in the environment and what we perceive. And there are certain terms in this equation that can be adjusted in order to maintain that perception. So it shows that there's a direct correspondence between movement and information. That's the point of this, representing this concept as this equation. And again, the point here being that a law of control implies achieving a tight coupling between information and movement, because as we move, we generate information. As information is generated, we then have to also move with respect to it in order to maintain that particular affordance or perception of that affordance. I'm going to give an example now of how this would look in order to achieve a more what's called the flycatcher problem. So how would we use information about a ball that's, imagine you're a fielder in cricket or baseball and a ball's been struck into the air. How do you guide your movement successfully with respect to the movement of the ball in order to make sure that you catch it? And so the way in which this problem gets solved in ecological psychology, or if we're using movements coupled to information, and without needing to make a prediction, right? If we couple our movements to moment information, we can successfully be in the right place at the right time to catch that ball without predicting where the ball will land, right? Without using a prediction. So the way this would work, one way this can work is, suppose you're standing here, right? Suppose you're standing here. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a pattern as the ball moves into the air. There'll be a pattern that gets picked up on your retina. Okay, and what it will look like is the ball will, from moment to moment, it will appear to be accelerating. So it will cover larger and larger distances as it moves through the air. And this indicates, if you're picking up acceleration, the ball appears to be moving faster and faster, it means it's going to land behind you, right? So what you need to do is you need to start to run faster yourself. You need to cancel out the acceleration so that the ball appears to be traveling at a constant velocity. And if you do this, if you use this canceling strategy, you will arrive at the right place at the right time. The same is true on the other side. So imagine you're standing over here, right? If the ball appears to be slowing down on your retina, so it jumps a very big distance, and then the next time step there's a smaller distance, so it's getting slower and slower, it means that the ball is going to land in front of you. So you need to move in such a way that the ball starts to appear to speed up. And you're going to have to move forward in this case, and in order to cancel out the deceleration, right? So that the ball appears to be moving at a constant velocity, and you will be able to successfully catch the ball. And the point here is that the person is modifying their actions in order to achieve a certain perception, right, of the ball moving at a constant velocity without making a prediction, right? From moment to moment, they're just regulating the movement to maintain a particular perception. And this is called perspective control. So there's no predictive prediction made. I'm reiterating this as many times as possible. We're using currently available information in order to achieve a future state. This is perspective control. Okay, so to summarize the law of control and affordances. So having an affordance, perceiving an affordance indicates that we've set up some law of control between our movement and what we perceive. And we move in such a way in order to maintain that perception. Okay? Our ability to set up a law of control, in part, it requires our ability to move, our action capabilities, and it implies perceiving what actions the environment offers, affordances. So perceiving affordances implies being able to set up a law of control, and the successful control of action occurs so long as an affordance is perceived. Okay. I think it's nice to end on this quote just to reiterate what an affordance is as a definition. So an affordance is a resource that the environment offers any animal that has the capability to perceive and use it. Affordances are meaningful to animals. They provide opportunity for a particular kind of behavior. And so affordance are properties of the environment, but taken with respect to the animal. Okay. So an affordance it's a relation between the individual and their environment. And they use this relationship to guide their movements in order to maintain that relationship. Okay, so I want you to take 5 minutes before moving on into the next section of the lecture, and you might reflect on this question of, do you need to be able to move in order to be able to perceive affordances? What do you think about this question? Okay, so we're going to look at some of the evidence supporting these concepts in ecological psychology. We're mainly going to focus on their links to the learning process. So the way ecological psychology summarizes the learning process, they look at it as one of a series of steps. Firstly, the discovery of affordances, the education of our attention, and our calibration, increasingly accurate relations between movement and information. So if we look at the learning process, again, we have these fundamental steps that are needed that are involved. So the first is to be able to set up a law of control or discover affordances. Once we've done that, the next steps involve educating attention, so converging on going from like less useful information to more useful information. So we change what information is used to the most relevant information possible, right? So if you imagine that Tau example with the ball, early on, perhaps you just use information that the ball, it seems to get bigger. So you don't take into account the distance of the ball. You just take into account the fact that it's getting bigger. And if you regulate your movements just to that information, your actions are going to be less useful compared to being able to couple your actions to tau, so the rate of expansion as well as the size of the object as well. So trying to converge on the most relevant information possible. And then the final step involves calibration, where you make some adjustment between in the relationship between your movement and information by changing constants in that relationship. So your intercept and slope terms, right? And once we've achieved this level of control, or we've achieved this calibration step, you might describe expertise as derived from achieving an increasing or improved fit between that person and their environment. So as we go through these steps, the individual is improving the fit between themselves and their environment. Okay, so let's look at this first step, the discovery of affordances. So the first step involves trying to establish a law of control. This step involves a lot of, as we understand it, involves a lot of exploratory behavior. And here what the individual needs to do is they need to find a new or alternative solution in order to achieve their task goal. So the analogy here that I'm using is of these targets, right? So imagine the person is, they're sort of over here, right? So they're off target completely. They're off in the wilderness somewhere. They're using completely they haven't really discovered a way to act in order to be successful. So they haven't successfully identified opportunities for action yet. The way in which we can facilitate this is allow the person to explore, and they will naturally, discover ways in which they can successfully act. And, from there they can start to refine that. But the early phase will involve a lot of exploratory behavior as they discover affordances or opportunities for action that allow them to achieve their task goals. So novices, people who might be injured or suffer some sort of a disorder, may need to discover or rediscover what the environment offers or doesn't offer. Okay, and I want to give an example of children, right? So I'll give an example of research or work in this visual cliff paradigm. Okay.
You have 10 minutes to finish your research. You rush into searching on Google, then you find a title that sounds credible. You enter the page and start reading with all your attention. By the time you read through the entire thing, you realize...
Okay.
Everyone has had some kind of an experience feeling something kind of like fear of heights, and it makes perfect common sense that we shouldn't jump over the edge of a drop-off because it's dangerous, and if it's dangerous, then we should probably be afraid of it.
Probably. Exactly how and when this hypothetical fear develops makes for pretty gleeful research inside Dr. Karen Adolph's lab.
We're discovering some surprising things that are flying in the face of, how people have studied locomotion for the last 100 years.
Including what babies do and feel when they're on a ledge.
So the story about fear of heights is that there was a very, very famous classical study in developmental psychology by Gibson and Walk in 1960 that showed that human infants and infants of a number of different species will avoid crossing over an apparent drop-off on what they called a visual cliff.
As soon as the baby can move about, he can be observed in the same way as other animals.
It's a glass table, and on one side there's a checkerboard pattern surface right under the glass. The other side of the table, the pattern surface is way down on the floor. So visually, it looks like a big 3-foot drop-off. So when human babies first begin crawling, most of them will crawl over the apparent drop-off, but after several weeks of crawling experience, then they'll begin to refuse to crawl over the drop-off. And the conventional interpretation of this was that infants are avoiding the drop-off because they're afraid of heights.
She's backing away very
No, she's not interested.
She wants no part of that side.
The experiment became the shaky foundation for the myth that crawling innately teaches us to fear heights.
Babies avoid going over the drop-off because they're afraid of heights. How do we know they're afraid of heights? Because they avoid crawling over the drop-off. So as you may have noticed, the argument is circular.
As it happened, the visual cliff was a better test of an infant's depth perception, not their fear of heights. And if you look closely, you may have actually noticed that the babies don't look particularly scared.
It is a perfectly safe surface of support. So after one trial, human infants cleverly figure this out, and then they will crawl over the drop-off.
So how do you really test if a baby's scared of heights?
You can test babies at the edge of a real cliff where there's no safety glass. It's just an actual drop-off, and the drop-off can be adjustable, so it can be little or really, really big.
And why stop there? Inside Dr. Adolph's Infant Action Lab, babies are tested on a variety of apparatuses.
You can test babies at the edge of a slope, so it can be steeper, 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 crossing bridges that are wide or narrow over a surface of support, and so on. If there's no safety glass, you can test the same baby dozens and dozens of trials in the same session. And that means that you can determine for each individual infant when they think that that surface is safe and when they think it's risky within a couple of degrees of accuracy, like 2 degrees of accuracy for a slope.
Dr. Adolph has spent 25 years running tests like these, and the resulting data sets are both convincing and adorable.
Infants spend most of each trial right at the edge of the precipice. They're reaching their arm down over the drop-off. They are putting their little feet or their little hands on the bridge and taking little tiny steps at the edge. And all the while they're doing it with either neutral or positive facial expressions.
What's more surprising is how their approach changes as they learn different forms of locomotion.
So what happens is that when babies first begin crawling, they'll crawl right over the edge. Then over weeks of crawling, their responses get more and more accurate until finally they're at adult-like levels so that they can tell precisely whether a slope is safe for crawling or whether a drop-off is safe for crawling. But then the next week, when these babies stand up and face these same drop-offs, same slopes, same apparatus, now as a new walker, they walk right over the edge. So in fact, there seems to be 4 learning curves in development as babies learn to sit, learn to crawl, as they learn to cruise, and then finally as they learn to walk. So if they were afraid of heights, you should just be afraid of heights. in the rain and on a train and in a tree. You shouldn't see 4 separate learning curves.
So if babies aren't learning to be afraid of heights, what are they learning?
I think that what babies are learning over weeks of sitting, crawling, cruising, walking is they're learning to perceive the relations between their bodies and the environment.
They're discovering what's possible and what's just a little too far.
And you can learn that without feeling any sort of fear at all. In fact, Eleanor Gibson, the person who first invented the visual cliff, wrote later in her life, as a goat is peering over the edge of a steep crag, it knows not to walk off the edge. And she said, I don't think it's feeling any emotions at all. It just knows not to go. And that's what we're seeing in babies.
Who probably know not to go. Probably. For Science Friday, I'm Luke Groskin.
Okay, so here what we've seen is, in that example, is these babies, when they're at the edge of what's possible, so that slope no longer supports crawling, they start to explore, and a different way of moving or a different law of control might need to be established in order to be able to keep going, right? So maybe they need to, go crawl backwards in order to be able to get down the slope. And it's also quite interesting that, as they discover new affordance, walking or cruising or crawling, whatever it is, they have to go through that process again where they use the affordance. They might use it inappropriately, by walking straight off the cliff. But through exploration, through practice, they determine, what's more appropriate ways of relating their movements to that environment in order to, not fall over, or in order to be able to get down an extreme slope. Okay, so as a side note, with respect to affordances, it's worth pointing out that there are different categories of affordances have been researched and that have been identified and discussed in the literature. So there's 2 examples in particular. One's called a body scale affordance, and another one's called an action scale affordance. So body scale affordances are relations between some measurable dimension of the person's body with respect to some other spatial or property in the environment that determines whether an action is possible. So a classic example is the ratio between a person's leg length and a stair riser. Okay, so for people with very short legs, right, a relatively small step might not afford walking, right? It might only afford crawling. They might have to crawl up the steps because they have a very short legs. So the ratio between leg to stair riser is closer to 1, right? Whereas tall people, they have long legs. For the same stair riser, they're able to walk up the stairs because the ratio is further from 1, right? So this would be an example of a body scale affordance. And it turns out that, if we were to, for each individual, if we continually increase the height of a stair, everybody roughly, on average, transitions from walking upstairs to crawling or climbing upstairs once the ratio between leg to stair riser hits roughly 0.88. Okay, and this, distinction between crawling, walking, a walkable affordance versus a climbable affordance, right, is body scaled. It's based on some relationship between some spatial relationship between the person and their environment. An action scaled affordance, on the other hand, is based on how a person can behave relative to the environment. And this is their ability to behave in a certain way determines whether the action is possible. And so we're talking about functional aspects of the individual. So, for example, how fast they are, how much force they can produce. Example for this, for example, some work that I did a couple of years ago looked at relationships between how strong a climber is and what opportunities there were in a climbing wall. So the stronger a climber is, the more ways in which they're able to climb through a climbing route. Compared to weaker climbers, they're only able to climb through a climbing route in a reduced number of ways. So those climbing affordances, so doing, I guess, a range of different grasping patterns, are in some way action scaled to how strong the individual is. Okay, so this next concept, once we've discovered an affordance, we then go through a process of educating our attention. And this is to try to discover what is the best information to couple our actions to. So education of attention is some adaptive change in information that gets coupled to movement. Sometimes it gets called things like attunement, differentiation, selection, or convergence. Sometimes this language is used when talking about the education of attention as well. And it implies that there's some change in rather than picking up and using non-specifying information, the person picks up and they use more relevant specifying variables. So for example, they move from what's called lower order or less useful information to higher order or more useful information. And in the catching example, it might be that rather than picking up on tau, they pick up on the distance of an object alone, or the fact that it seems to be getting bigger and bigger, rather than both of those in unison. So the education of attention is seen as a process by which somebody learns what variables to attend to in which situation. And another way of sort of thinking about this education of attention is, imagine you've got an affordance, you're relatively inaccurate because in how you control your movements to maintain that affordance, but once you've picked up or worked out what the best information is to use to maintain that opportunity, you start to become much more accurate. So last week we used the example of, okay, let's say you were trying to stop a soccer ball, you're a goalkeeper. A beginner might try to use all sorts of information from the person who's running up towards them. They might use the person's head or their arms, or what have you. Whereas an expert, they're using much more relevant information to base that judgment off. Okay. An example of a study that involved educating attention. This is a nice paper by Raoul Udajans in 2005, where they had participants where they used an experimental protocol designed to influence the person to try to change what they attend to support their action. So what they did was they manipulated visual information during a basketball shot. And what they did in particular is they had these occlusion goggles, so goggles that you can't see through, right? But what would happen is, as people would be training to do shots on the basket and from different positions, and some individuals trained using this technique where when the hands came above the head during the shot process, the glasses opened up and people could see. So what the researchers are trying to do is have the basketball player try to use information that's attend to use information or educate their attention to information that is useful only in that later phase of the shot, right? And presumably this is information that is, let's say, only useful for the shot. And what they found is that the people who trained in this way, that educated their attention to late stage critical information, improved their match performance, their shooting match performance. So through the training session, across the intervention session, which happened over a season, their shot percentages increased across the intervention period, and their performance in games after the intervention also improved. Okay. So in this example, the researchers have initiated some process that requires the learner to try to find more useful information to support, shooting the basketball. So they've created a situation where they've tried to educate the attention to more relevant information, and it seems to have worked. The final step in this process is called calibration. So it's interesting. So if you have errors, so calibration is this final step that involves accurately coupling the amplitude or the size of your movements with respect to your perceptions. And this calibration process implies, in particular, modifying constants in this relationship between movement and information. And one way to think about this calibration stage is, okay, the person, they're using a particular affordance, and they're using the appropriate information to maintain that affordance, right? But there's a consistent error in their performance, right? So they might be consistently overestimating, or they're consistently arriving too late or too early. And so what's needed is a realignment or an adjustment in the amplitude of the movement, for instance, or the timing of the movement with respect to that information in order to be accurate again. And you could imagine this a scenario where you have an athlete who gets injured, right? They get injured. They're an elite athlete. They know what affordances are useful for achieving particular objectives. They know what information to use to maintain that affordance, but they get, and they might be very well calibrated and accurate, but then they get injured, right? So their muscles get a bit atrophied, a bit weaker. And so they might need to go through a process of recalibration after the injury to make sure that they can perform accurately and back to their standard. They don't need to rediscover what the appropriate information is. They need to more appropriately calibrate their movement to that information to get back in the game. So calibration errors don't just manifest in terms of movement accuracy, but also in terms of movement coordination as well. Also want to give an example in aging. So it's interesting that there's an age-related decline in the ability to use visual information to guide stepping movements. And it turns out with elderly people, it seems that they start to look earlier at a target before they move their foot, and they move their eyes away from the target before they hit it. So they make these consistent errors, let's say, in the way they link their gaze to their movements. And it suggests that there's some sort of shift in the calibration between those. And it might be that, we might be able to support more appropriate visual strategy in elderly people by finding some way to help them recalibrate their visual motor relationships. All right, so let's sum things up. We have these stages that can be indicated, so the stages of education of attention, or calibration that get indicated by different types of errors that are produced in practice. So you can, on the basis of those pattern of errors, determine what stage the person might be having trouble with. You can, of course, promote the discovery, the education, and calibration. You can promote these people learning in these stages using the various techniques that we've learned about in the course so far. So you can use feedback, focus of attention, variability of practice, observational learning. All of these tools allow you to help the person go through these stages. So, for example, imagine a variability of practice context, right? So you're changing the environment from one practice to the next. You might be using a randomized schedule of practice, and this requires the person to constantly change what they're attending to. And this process of change is facilitating exploration, and it might help them to discover the most appropriate information to be coupling their movements to across these different conditions. So to sum up, with this framework, ecological psychology, it's an anti-representational framework. We don't call on representations to make sense of information. Information in the environment directly corresponds to information that we pick up, and that information that we pick up directly corresponds to our perceptions. So the key is to pick up the most useful information possible and relate our movements to that information. And this involves establishing an affordance or a law of control, so discovering a opportunity for action and then moving in such a way as to maintain the perception of that opportunity. And there are three general stages through which this occurs: the discovery of affordances, the education of attention to the most relevant information, and the fine-tunement or calibration of our movements with respect to that information. So here we've characterized expertise as a change in the relationship between ourselves and the environment, not on the basis of a more and more accurate representation in the central nervous system. So now that you've worked through that part of the lecture, take a moment to look at this question: is it relevant to train your anticipation skill without completing the interceptive action? The final section of the lecture, we're going to look at applying some of these ideas using this notion called representative design. And this is one of the, I think, strong applications of ecological psychology. We'll look at a few different examples of this approach, including how it's involved in the occlusion paradigm. It's linked to behavior in a lab versus in a real performance environment. We'll talk about affordances in sport, and we'll end on this a final wrap-up of representative design. Okay, so the occlusion paradigm. You've been exposed to this paradigm quite a lot through this semester, and it basically looks like this. Essentially what it is you have a person gets exposed to a videotape, and where they have to make some decision based on the information that they see. And the videotape will cut off. So you only get a certain amount of information from which to base your decision. So for example, with this person here, let's say we have to make a judgment about which way they're going to go, right? Are they going to run left or right? Okay. And the more frames that you get to observe, typically the more accurate your judgment is. Okay. And people who are more expert, they tend to use or require less frames before they, in order to be successful, compared to a beginner needing to see much more frames. So this is the occlusion paradigm. And one of the critiques of this paradigm, where people are making decisions and we're trying to understand expertise or anticipation expertise, is that these paradigms primarily and almost exclusively assess perception. They don't include action in the experiment. So the person is just making a judgment, oh, he's going left or he's going right. And they might be doing that just by touching they might use an arrow on a keyboard in order to make that decision, which is quite different to the ways in which people act and make decisions in sport contexts. One of the findings in this paradigm is that experts are able to use more advanced information, whereas beginners really depend on ball flight information, particularly in predicting interceptive tasks. And one of the criticisms here is, again, what I've said is this is not a very representative situation that you would find yourself in order to make an interceptive action. People don't make interceptive actions with video footage, right? It's also interesting is what we're observing is we're watching experts use non-specifying information to base their judgment off, whereas beginners really need that information from the ball flight to be able to make a good judgment. So it indicates that experts can use non-specifying information. The question is, in a real context, is that what they do? So one way to address this sort of question is to look at research in situ tasks. So trying to research what the person's looking at and what they're using to guide their decisions off while they're actually trying to stop penalty shots instead of using a video-based approach. And this paper here by Pyrrhus and Vickers, what they found is that, okay, in goalkeeping tasks, in real goalkeeping tasks, what people do is what the goalkeepers do, instead of following the movement of the body from like head to toe, as we learned as a strategy that's used last week, right? Rather than going from head to toe, what these people do is they'll find a visual pivot point and they'll just stay there and let everything else, I suppose, use their peripheral vision in order to pick up what the kicker's doing. Another interesting thing about this is that, look, with the goalkeeper, the expert goalkeeper, the ability to predict what the person is going to do early doesn't necessarily imply that they're going to move early, right? So one of the things that's for sure true is that for both experts and beginners, the more information that they're able to be exposed to, the more accurate their decisions are, right? And one of the reasons for this, for example, in sport is, or in this task in particular, is that the kicker might be trying to deceive you, right? Which way they're going to kick. So the more and more of that kick that you get to observe, the more reliable your decision is going to be. So that's another point that needs to be made with respect to these studies. And this study, this data here from Dix et al. 2010, basically what they showed is that, okay, they compared in situ, so needing to dive to stop a ball versus using a joystick to indicate which way the ball would go. These conditions, for example, the VSM condition is using a joystick to indicate what direction to go, so they're using video, and they're tracking the position of the gaze through the kick. And what they show is this, this proximal to distal sequencing and where people look. right? When just before the person makes ball contact, they arrive on the ball. In situ conditions, so this ISM condition, in situ with movement, right? And in situ with diving, this final one here, right? What the individual does when they in situ with diving is this bottom one, and the one above is one where they indicate that the person's going to go left or right by just indicating that they're going to go left or right. But this final condition requires that they actually make an attempt to stop the ball. In this final condition, what the player does at the very beginning of the run-up, the goalkeeper fixates at the head, and then they jump to the ball and they just stay at the ball for the whole time. So a totally different pattern of gaze behavior under this real-world representative condition. I'm going to stay on this example, and we're going to actually replicate these ideas in the laboratory experiment for this week. So we're going to talk about affordances in sport and link them to tasks that involve anticipation. So I've talked a lot about, we talked about prospective control, right? What about these tasks that require prediction? How does ecological psychology explain the way in which we act in these sorts of highly time-constrained tasks? So if we take the average time for a ball to travel to the corner of a net, it takes roughly 600 milliseconds for this on average. For good goal kickers, to kick a ball, it takes about 600 milliseconds to get there. If you take the average time that it takes somebody to jump, either left or right, so to close that distance, the average time it takes someone to jump from here to here is roughly 800 milliseconds, right? So we've got a situation where the goalkeeper needs to move. They need to move before the ball gets kicked if they have any hope of intercepting it. So it's a task that requires you make some predictive judgment. You anticipate what's going to happen and you act on that. You act before the ball gets kicked. So a nice study by Dix, they did a follow-up study where they measured how fast a soccer player, how fast the goalkeeper was. So they measured their action capabilities. So how fast can a goalkeeper get from here to here? And they wanted to see if how fast the goalkeeper was influenced their behavioral strategy. And what they showed was that the baseline movement time of the goalkeeper was correlated to when they started to move. Okay? And what this data shows is people who are faster, so values down here, right? They tended to move later in the person's run-up. So closer to when the ball was about to be kicked. So the faster you are, the longer you can observe the run-up and the longer you can wait before you commit to one way or another. Whereas slow goalkeepers, keepers who take a longer time to jump from the middle to the side of the goal, they have to start to move earlier in the person's run-up. So they get exposed to less information of the person's run-up before committing to one way or the other. And this is showing that these athletes are trying to use specifying information to support their movement, to support their anticipation judgment. So their judgments are being constrained by their own action capabilities with respect to this relationship with the information that's most useful for stopping the ball. A final example, another interesting example, is in cricketing. Right, so some of this data here comes from Ian Renshaw's PhD thesis, and what Ian did was he looked at the difference in behaviour when and the timing of behavior when facing cricket projection machines, bowling ball projection machines, and when facing a live bowler. And what he's done is he's measured, with respect to the moment that the ball is released, the timing of key behaviors. So the initiation of backswing, the initiation of the front foot movement, initiation of downswing, front foot placement, and impact. And what he showed is that when facing a ball machine, right? When facing a ball machine, the person is essentially playing catch up the whole way through. So a bowler will initiate their bat swing up. They'll get to these stages like initiation of forward foot movement, initiation of downswing, initiation of front foot placement. They're increasingly ahead in time of those key events. So they've got more room for error, let's say, when facing a live bowler. And so this data suggests, look, different information is being used when dealing with the ball projection machine versus when dealing with a bowler. Obviously, the information that's different is that, you know, the batter is able to regulate their movements with respect to information coming from the bowler as well as the ball, right? So there's information in the bowler's run-up that is useful in regulating the batter's action. And this slide here is just simply a summary of everything I've said here. And you've got to ask yourself, if you're helping cricketers practice and improve, you've got to ask yourself, okay, what is the role of a ball projection machine in cricket? And you know, for sure, there's a place for these sorts of devices, but there's also, you know, things about them that, you know, are lacking or not representative of the competition context. And people who, you know, practice solely with ball projection machines, I would suspect are at a disadvantage compared to those who get a lot of time practicing against live bowlers. And this links to, I guess, a model which combines, you know, prediction with predictive control with prospective control, and how this might relate to these different visual systems that we've learnt about. So in these tasks where we need to make some sort of anticipated judgment, these early parts of someone, you know, running up towards us that we might be using their kinematics to make some judgment, that sort of phase of a task, we might be more using strategic control or information going to the temporal lobe. Once the ball's been released and we get access to increasingly reliable information, we might then allow the posterior pathway to take over, where we use more prospective control in the later stages of these tasks. So this concept of representative design is all about, in some ways, it's all about, and what it does, what it refers to is the degree to which aspects of your competition or the context that you want to have your skill be used in, the degree to which the key aspects of that context is represented in the training context. And it's argued that if you make a task more representative, it's going to allow them to use information to develop adaptive movement solutions that are more likely to transfer to the competition context, right? And there are different ways that we can maximize representative design when we design tasks. And this is something coaches or therapists should be aware of. So the first is they should be ensuring that there's functional relationships between perception and action. There's opportunities to move and uncover information. You preserve, relevant, specifying and non-specifying information that's available in competition. So the bowler's run-up as well as the ball flight trajectory. You can maintain, or you should try to maintain, action fidelity. The movement patterns that you see in training should also be occurring in competition. There should be a match between the two. And if there's not, then there's probably a problem in the way in which the task is designed. The final thing is to ensure that the task and environment varies to the same extent that you might see in competition. So you should be exposing people to different pitched conditions and a relative degree of uncertainty. So these, because this is something that naturally happens in performance contexts. So the training should also represent that variation as well, if you're going to expect what the person is practicing is going to be useful in the competition context. And I'll end on a final study here that I think exemplifies, I guess, another aspect of this as well, and primarily emotion. So this study here, what it is it's a study looking at Taekwondo players, and they looked at competitive bouts between Taekwondo players who were doing competitive bouts with people that they knew, so training partners that they commonly work with. They then looked at competition bouts or training bouts when competing with people they don't know, so people from a different club. And the researchers measured the participants' emotion, right? And what they found across the board, these on indicators of emotion, right? Anxiety, excitement, anger, and happiness. These all increased from, there's a significant change when we're facing new or different training partners. And so this is just highlighting again the complex ways in which representative design might impact on your athlete. It might not just happen at the level of the movement pattern. There's also these other aspects that come into play when we try to design tasks that are representative. And of course, by doing this, you're going to be influencing the player's ability to come up with some sort of adaptive strategy to manage these emotions, and that therefore hopefully will allow them to manage those emotions in competition. Okay, so now that you've worked through the 3 sections of the lecture, just invite you to look at these questions a final time. Make sure that you've worked through the tasks required for this week and worked on the learning objectives in order to prepare you for the final exam.